the role of the private sector in advancing President Biden's infrastructure program. Topic of my discussion today with Liz Dubeck. She is a project finance and development partner with the law firm of O'Melveny Myers. Hello, Liz.
Hello, thank you so much for having me today.
So I think we can agree that the private sector does have a key role to play in this infrastructure program, and I'm trying to understand exactly what that would be. More specifically, what are the prospects for privatization of government-owned assets under this infrastructure program? Can that happen, and how might that happen?
I think it absolutely can. The private sector is going to be an important part of the redevelopment of the various sectors that are implicated in this very ambitious plan that the Biden administration has set forth. We have seen some privatization of government assets in the past in this country, but it is not nearly as advanced as it has become in Europe and Canada and some other areas. So there's a lot of opportunity for innovation and ways to make sure that we can find profitable ways, efficient ways to have the private sector take over government assets or otherwise participate in the development and operation of government assets. Mm-hmm. We've seen that already to some extent in infrastructure assets such as airports, toll roads, sometimes social infrastructure such as courthouses, civic centers. And given the breadth of the infrastructure development that the Biden plan is looking to continue to develop under this new program, I think there's a lot of opportunity for that across the board.
Well, does the privatization of such interests generally lead to some kind of, as you mentioned, toll or user fee or something that allows that private interest to recoup its investment?
Absolutely. There are P3s and being public-private partnerships, and the involvement of the private sector generally doesn't mean that we get these projects for free. It's not a new source of funding, and there is a lot of capital interested in infrastructure investment in the United States. But those investors do need to be paid back. They need to be both compensated for the work that they do, but they also need to earn an equity return. So in some cases, there can be costs to private entities taking on infrastructure projects that the government wouldn't have. Mm-hmm. However, those costs in many cases, though not all, are viewed as worth that additional cost because of the efficiencies, the experience, and the general sort of know-how that the private sector can bring. So it's not a panacea. It's not a way to get free projects, but it can certainly be an important way to get a number of these projects done more efficiently and ultimately at a lower cost if they are done more quickly or more efficiently.
But it nevertheless does require a pretty substantial upfront cost. And it takes a long time I don't know if depreciation fits into it or something, but in any case, I'm wondering to what extent are these financially viable things that for private enterprise to do? Are they going to recover their investment? Are they going to get a return on equity? Isn't it an attractive investment for a lot of these companies?
I think the history of these projects in the United States and elsewhere shows that they absolutely can be. As I said, it's not a panacea. It may not work for every type of infrastructure investment, particularly some of the areas that are included in the Biden administration plan that are a little outside these sort of core infrastructure areas we normally think of. We see elder care, housing, childcare are areas that are broadly within the umbrella of infrastructure as described in this plan. Right. And those areas have not yet seen the same sorts of public-private partnerships that we normally think of in the infrastructure space. But toll roads, airports, and some of the other areas we've talked about, there can be structures that can be profitable without making those assets, out of reach of normal Americans who they're generally supposed to assist and be provided for.
Do you believe that these might encounter some public sensitivities or even opposition, depending on the type of asset to be privatized? The public, to some extent, has accepted a certain amount of toll roads, but could there be a limit there to the point where they say, we don't want to have to pay for these on a user basis? It should be baked into the budget the way it has been in the past.
I think that's absolutely right. Depending on the asset, that's a concern. Areas like water infrastructure is one that tends to be particularly politically sensitive. Right. But not to say that is, that P3s are off the table or private investment is off the table in those areas as well. Depending on the structure of the transaction, user fees, frankly, may or may not be part of the way that these projects are funded. Sometimes you have, scheduled government payments, availability payments from the government to the private sector. The money certainly has to come from somewhere at the end of the day, but it may or may not be a user fee in every circumstance.
So you're saying in that case, the government would be compensating the private interest over a period of years going forward.
That's correct.
Right. So the money therefore would actually be, even though on its surface a public-private partnership, ultimately the money would come from public funds down the line.
That's right. I think ultimately these infrastructure projects are going to be paid for with one of two sources, that is tax revenues or user fees. The involvement of the private sector can, when used appropriately, and to make projects more efficient, faster, to really harness the expertise and efficiency of the private sector. Their main benefit is they can lower the overall cost of a project by introducing that efficiency, as well as allowing the project to potentially be run better and taking advantage of all of the private sector's expertise. But at the end of the day, somebody does need to pay for these projects.
And does a private-public partnership, does it go hand in hand with other funding capabilities, such as perhaps an increase in the federal fuel tax, or is it a replacement for that?
I think all the sources of funding are on the table at the moment. I know the administration so far has said they are not looking at an increase in the fuel tax, but I know this is the beginning of what is likely to be a long negotiation. So I don't think anything is really off the table. Again, because the Biden infrastructure plan at this point is so broad, it touches on areas of infrastructure that have not traditionally been paid for by the gas tax. So there are a lot of opportunities for other funding sources to come in and potentially to augment or replace sources that are currently funding these projects.
Does the presence of a private company involved in construction of these infrastructure projects, does it influence the choice of which projects to undertake?
I think it certainly can. As you noted, for these projects to be successful with private involvement, they need to be projects that are profitable and will allow the private parties to recoup both their costs and earn an equity return. Infrastructure is, our assets and services that really the country needs to support our productivity. And some of those are the quintessential public goods that may not be in themselves profitable. And those are areas where a P3 may not work. And we need the government itself to provide these services that are critical, but may not be, from a private sector standpoint, profitable to the degree required.
Those could still go forward potentially under a more traditional type of funding mechanism.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Also, the influence of legislators on choosing these projects. In the past, it's been referred to, as you know, as pork or things like that. To what extent does a public-private partnership and the selection criteria that go with it, does that replace the traditional legislators' voice, local legislators, in choosing these projects, or are they also a factor in deciding what goes forward?
Well, I think particularly in our political environment, the legislators' voices are going to be a necessary part of this and are going to be important. I think all of the pieces work together in identifying profitable projects that the private sector will be excited about and able to contribute that expertise, experience, and capital at a profitable, profitable rate of interest and return. Those are going to be critical, but you're still going to need the support of the local, state, and federal politicians related to a particular jurisdiction to get through the permitting and other requirements that are needed for any of these projects.
Yeah, you alluded to the fact that we have had such projects in the past, and indeed we do have a number of toll roads and user fees at various facilities around the country. But to what extent would this be unprecedented in scale? I don't believe that anything has been undertaken this ambitious, involving this much of the private sector working with government. Would it indeed be unprecedented in that respect?
Certainly within the lifetimes of any of us currently talking about how to implement this plan. This really is, at least as initially proposed, of course, this is the beginning of what are expected to be long negotiations, but as initially proposed, this is of a scale that is unprecedented in terms of both geographic reach, the number of industries affected, and the sheer dollar amount that we're looking at is really an opportunity to kind of throw everything at the ceiling and see what sticks.
Yeah, it does seem that I would think the presence of the private sector contributing to this initiative is necessary to making the entire infrastructure proposal palatable, because such previous proposals, as you know, have crashed and burned repeatedly over the over the unwillingness of Congress to to authorize a sufficient number of funds. So do you think that this is a necessary thing in order to get any kind of infrastructure project out of Congress at all?
I think depending on the scale, and certainly anything around the scale of what we're currently looking at, we're really going to need to pull from all resources. Infrastructure generally is spoken about as though it's, the one area where there's bipartisan agreement on the need to invest in infrastructure. But when you come to that question of how you pay for it, there's a huge divide, as there always has been, and which has been the source of stalled plans in the past. So certainly the more we can get away from the more controversial sources of funds, the easier this will be. But as we've discussed, at the end of the day, the money is going to need to come from somewhere. And this is an incredibly large scale investment that the president is looking to be made.
And as you described earlier, the president widening the definition of what constitutes infrastructure, might that also be problematic in the minds of people who don't want to go beyond literal transportation, physical infrastructure?
Well, I think there's always going to be a political debate, and infrastructure itself has no firm boundaries into the term. And so I think, as we've already seen the debate that's emerging on this plan, a number of folks on the more traditional side in Congress have focused on the relatively limited number of dollars that are going towards roads and bridges. But I think the public, as well as this administration, do generally have a sense that infrastructure could and should be broader than that. Things like broadband, things like water, particularly in light of the Flint water crisis, the recent energy crisis in Texas. I think people intuitively have a sense that infrastructure should be more than roads and bridges. But there will certainly be a debate about what the contours should be, whether it should go all the way to areas like elder care, schooling, housing.
Wow. So many details to be worked out, and yet maybe some hope for that this might be the one that actually takes after all these years of attempting to repair our nation's infrastructure. Liz Dubeck of O'Melveny and Myers, thanks for guiding us through this thicket of issues related to infrastructure and helping us to understand what we might be facing going forward. Thanks a lot. Really appreciate your time.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much. Have a good afternoon.
You too.